Hi there, this is Jennifer Shepard, the Lipstick Mystic, speaking to you today on Wednesday, April 24th, 2013. I thought it might be easier for me to express some of what I've been experiencing and feeling and working on in the form of an audio rather than a long article. I actually started working on a written report about this, and I realized it was going to be 70 or 80 pages, and probably more time would be spent trying to edit that and put that together than could comfortably be spent just talking to you for a few minutes in an audio format today. Last week here in America, the Boston Marathon bombings took place, and it was a very, very strange week. We also saw earthquakes on the Iraq-Pakistani border, and also in China, and also in Japan, I believe, over the course of that week. And there was also an event here in America in Waco, Texas, where there was a massive explosion at a fertilizer plant. Just prior to that, I don't know if it was a week or a few days before all this took place, there was a stabbing at a college in Texas where a deaf student who had been immersed in video games, feeling more and more alienated and disenfranchised, went on a stabbing spree where he killed some people down at a college in Texas. There was definitely a disturbance in the force going on. If you live outside the U.S., unfortunately, you've probably given up on us because so many of the news events that seem to come out of America these days are just random, stupid shootings. Somebody shoots up kids in a school, shoots up a bunch of people in a mall. A mad gunner with guns is running around a college, university somewhere. Unfortunately, these events have become very, very common. But this past week, there was definitely what I would call a disturbance in the force. And I felt it a few days leading up to the events of the Boston bombings. And I always talk about the shamanic tradition that is honored in the Huna, or Hawaiian form of shamanic spirituality, in which what's going on a small level with an individual person or just a couple of people gets mirrored on a macrocosmic level. So we see the microcosm and the macrocosm relating to one another. And one of the fascinating components of Huna spirituality, and I don't claim to be an expert on it, but this is the native indigenous spirituality of the Samoan people who lived in Hawaii, still live in Hawaii today, although there's very few Huna practitioners that are publishing or teaching out in the mainstream anymore, unfortunately. And their indigenous knowledge of spirituality and how energy operates probably goes back to very, very ancient times, like the ancient civilization of Lemuria, of which Hawaii was a part of. And many of the Pacific Islands were also a part of Lemuria. And in various indigenous traditions, both in Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Australia, and also the Samoan Islands of what has become Hawaii here in the U.S., there is a type of spirituality that talks about how when we're seeing events going on a global level, a larger community level, that are disturbing or that are distressing, we need to look at where those same problems, those same energies, those same disturbances exist within us as individuals and us as tribes, with just a few family members or a few friends or colleagues, because the macrocosm and the microcosm are infinitely and very intimately related. And so sometimes the tradition within Huna spirituality is to heal larger global events by going within yourself and really saying, how can I heal these larger events by healing the same energy within me? That's just one way of looking at some of these disturbing incidents that are going on. It's not the only way, but it's one technique that I encourage people to explore. For example, one of the things I see coming out of the news coverage and the conspiracy theorists coming out of the events of the Boston bombings is the theme of continual disenfranchisement that a lot of young white men are going through here in the U.S. and elsewhere around the world. Very often the young men that you hear doing a bunch of shootings here in the U.S., shooting up a mall, shooting up a bunch of politicians, shooting up a bunch of kids, the same themes repeat themselves. Young white men who, for whatever reasons, and I think this is often because they've been raised on video games and television and movies and they've had very little social interaction, they don't feel very confident relating to other people. Emotions and empathy are not real easy for them, and they were never given something like theater training or theater workshops where you have to relate with people on an emotional level and you get to play and you get to have fun and you get to understand that every emotion you have is legitimate and real and has value and importance. And if you're in a safe environment like a theater workshop or a theater class, you can quickly experiment with feeling emotion and projecting emotion and sharing that in a imaginative sort of play space that allows you to build social skills. Young men traditionally have more problems with this than young women. And whether you want to call that a function of biology, conditioning, or spirituality, it doesn't really matter. The fact is we have a lost generation of young men right now on our planet who pretty much have been sat down in front of the video games, which have gotten more and more violent and more hypnotic and more loaded with subliminal programs over the past 20 years. And then they also are isolated because they're dealing with the internet and downloadable porn and this sort of objectification of sex and relationship as something that exists outside of them, instead of feeling like, you know, they could just go down the street and hang out at the coffee house and maybe talk to a nice girl and say, hi, you know, my name's John. How are you doing? I live locally. I'm going to school, or I'm working on a project that I'm excited about. What is it that you're involved with? These basic social skills have really gotten lost with a lot of young men. And when you deal with someone who is also isolated for other reasons, either because he's autistic and he may have abilities that are quite genius level, because some autistic people really are geniuses in certain ways, and some autistic people are on the other side of the spectrum where they're really not very functional. These are people who are screaming all the time, who can't take care of themselves, you know, a 20-year-old that has the mentality and intelligence of a 6-year-old, and the parents have to change the diapers, and quite honestly, to be rude about it, they're, you know, putting their shit on the walls, and, you know, they're really quite a handful. And the parents are usually overwhelmed and unable to take care of such children, but they do their best. There's no funding really available for extremely disabled children and autistic kids anymore, especially as they become young adults. And our whole mental health system here in the United States is a disaster. Thanks to Ronald Reagan, who started throwing out all the patients in the mental facilities back in the 80s, we're dealing with a mental health pandemic in the U.S. that has never really been addressed or corrected. And now, when 1 out of 55 kids being born is diagnosed on the autism spectrum, some of those who will never ever be able to support themselves or function in normal adult relationships, we've got a crisis of enormous proportions here in the U.S., and nobody is talking about it. But some of these people that are implicated in some of these events with the shootings and the violence are just disenfranchised young people who don't know how to relate in the world and feel very alienated, very distressed, and very unhappy. And so they become very susceptible to fundamentalist aspects of a religion, such as the Islamic religion, which reportedly these two Chechen young men who are implicated in the Boston Marathon bombings may have fallen under the sway of some very fundamentalist Muslim teachings, which are more into the idea of jihad against infidels and those who are not appropriate and who are not acting the way Allah has set out, which pretty much is everybody in America, since we don't really adhere to some of those particular concepts as outlined in the Quran. And so you can see how beautiful young men can be alienated, disenfranchised, and driven down a path of such isolation and despair that they can fall prey to violence. And I'm not justifying anything that's happened with the Boston bombings, but I'm saying that the larger issue that I'm seeing out in the world, especially over the past 12 months here in America, where there have been so many people, young, white, disenfranchised men, none of them Muslim, except in this supposed recent suspects involved with the Boston Marathon bombing, disenfranchised, caught up in the video games, feeling like whatever they're trying to do with their education or their personal life is just not working, and turning to violence, which they see around them all the time. I mean, when you play violent video games for 6 or 7 hours a day, every day, what's going to happen to you after a while? You're going to become desensitized to the idea of violence, and you're going to be going down a very isolated place within your mind that gets increasingly disenfranchised and disconnected from the people around you. You start going into a very, very bad place mentally and emotionally, and this has just become very common. Right now, of all the people I know who have young men who are children or younger members of their family in the range of 15 years of age to 25, there's a huge disproportionate number of these young men who are falling through the cracks into mental illness, video game addiction, porn addiction, never even trying to complete college or get a job or relate to others. The parents are allowing them to live in the basement, to live in the spare room, and making only token attempts to get these young men socialized and help and brought into a world of being a responsible adult that relates to others in a humane and equal way. So none of them have girlfriends. Many of them are on antidepressants, which sometimes makes things horribly worse. And what you see is young parents who are in their 40s finding that their children in their early 20s are never going to leave home and are sinking further and further into mental illness, violent ideologies as played out in the video games, and if someone also has religious leanings, they will fall into sometimes some very, very bad pathways with fundamentalist religions or embracing violent ideology. Or another aspect that you see is people falling into what I call the darker side of the conspiracy theory movement, where young men are obsessively accessing certain websites that talk about very inflammatory and sometimes entirely inaccurate ideas about what's going on with our government, what's going on with our military, and what's going on with our media. And it's interesting, the supposed Russian Chechenian emigre Boston Marathon bombers, one of them was supposedly a fan of Alex Jones' InfoWars site, which is a very popular conspiracy site. And earlier this year, there was a character, Holmes, who shot up a bunch of people in a theater during the premiere of the Batman movie, and he was arrested. And he was supposedly interested in another conspiracy website, AboveTopSecret.com. Neither of these sites is the cause of these people's horrific actions. But what I'm seeing right now this past week, and again, it's April 24th, 2013, is how conspiracy theorists and conspiracy websites have been so quick to post photos that have been taken out of context off of some video camera, or come to conclusions about it being a false flag event, or it's the Navy SEALs that were pictured in one image who dropped their backpack very quickly so that they could go attend to the wounded, that these guys were somehow the ones who were the operatives who created this incident. And I am seeing every single one of my contemporaries caught up in promoting absolute bullshit. It's been a very tough week for me because I've just recently come out with my first book, and I'm sort of a combination of contrarian in the world of metaphysics, spirituality, holistic health, conspiracy theory, but at the same time I try to help you see pieces of those ideas that have great value. And this past week I've seen Alex Jones, David Icke, Jeff Rensa, Ken Adachi at educateyourself.org, Stuart Wilde, all these people just jumping at the gun to say everything from, oh, these events weren't even real, the guy who got his legs amputated was obviously a paid actor. Let me tell you, I have a friend whose son and the son's girlfriend were 2 blocks away when the bombings happened. The girl had run the marathon and thank God had just finished. She was sort of in that range of runners that were not at the very front of the runners, but were pretty quick with their running times, and she had just finished up, and the boyfriend was there waiting for her at the finishing line, and they're 2 blocks away when the shit goes down. I can tell you for an absolute fact, that those people on the scene were not fucking actors. The mayhem there was horrible. And even 2 blocks away, these poor 2 young people got caught up in it. And they knew people who were hurt. So I am so disgusted right now at every single person out there in the so-called contrarian conspiracy theory movement. I don't know if you would call it a movement, because it's a lot of independent people, getting all excited. They're jazzed up on Red Bull and usually marijuana, and they're, looking at some photo that they've taken off of some website that somebody says is taken right from the scene, and it's evidence that it's a false flag, and our government's against us, and it's all just a bunch of, actors. And I'm not saying that our government doesn't constantly manipulate us. And I'm not saying that there isn't a very serious black ops arm to our government, but we're not going to know what they're up to. They're not the facade that we see. They're the man behind the curtain, so to speak, that have their own agenda and their own stuff going on. And I write about some of the very, very scary close encounters I've had with the black ops folks in my new book, which is called The Lipstick Mystic's Guide to Time Traveling, which includes my experiences of having the black ops side of the government try to recruit me as a remote viewer. They try to take psychic people who have remote viewing capabilities and recruit them into various intelligence operations. And at the time, it was so creepy and so horrible and so violative the way they came at me. And I called them every kind of motherfucker and, tell them to leave me the fuck alone. And I was attacked and I nearly died. And there is a direct cause and effect. You don't go up against these characters and live very often. That's why I've kept kind of a low profile the last 10 years, and I've only recently come out with my book, and I honestly don't know if I'm going to keep publishing it, because there's a huge amount of people out there who seem to take my stuff and my material as some kind of psychic woman trying to spread crap or bullshit, and I don't have the time to deal with that level of ignorance. This past week, there was a disturbance in the force. Part of me wants to explain what was really going on, but I don't know if I really want to get into it here. Essentially, there are some very negative beings. You can call them archons, ETs, interdimensionals, demons, or just pieces of shit. I don't care what you call them. Periodically, they lose control of this planet. Humanity actually starts to grow and to evolve and experience times of peace and evolution and joy. And so they will create what's basically a psychic shock or a seismic shock that goes through the planet. And what you'll see is some kind of external events where people are being very violent with each other, and then the aftermath of the people of that country reacting with horror and sadness and depression and fear and anger, all those normal human emotions when something horrible happens. But you'll also almost always see actual seismic shocks on the Earth itself, where the tectonic plates of the Earth react with larger than normal earthquakes. And then you'll also often see secondary events going on that have to do with violence or bloodshed with the actual peoples of the Earth. And we're very isolated here in America. We have this belief that we're engaged in these foreign wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Our media has so controlled things. We've never seen footage of the veterans' coffins returning from the Middle East. We've never really seen true numbers of the civilian casualties in either Iraq or Afghanistan, even though there are millions of people at this point, and those people have every right to fucking hate America because of the shit we've done over there that had nothing to do with going after Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden. It's the slaughter and the genocide of 2 different countries of people. But in America, we're very cushioned. Our media has been told, don't ever publish anything about, we don't even see anything in the news about veterans who come home with brain injuries or amputations and what they're going through. A lot of them are living in poverty, a lot of them are homeless. And the things going on in veteran hospitals, you don't want to know. I have insiders on that patrol that have shared with me some really horrible things. And so in some ways, when there's bombs going off in Syria, where the people there are desperately fighting for some kind of, civil rights and trying to overcome the horrible dictator there, or you see things going on in Iraq or Afghanistan, and we hear reports here that 30 people died in a bomb attack, it's all very abstract to us. Our media cushions us and says, hey, this doesn't matter, you know? And so it takes an event like the Boston bombings to sort of wake Americans up to the fact that we live in a world system where there's still too much of this violence going on, and a lot of it is driven by religious ideology, and religions are all evil because they all teach you how to hate somebody else, and they all teach you that you're better than everybody else. If you're Jewish, you're the chosen people and you're better than everybody else. If you're Christian, Jesus is going to take care of you and absolve you of every horrible nasty thing that you've done through the course of this and maybe past lifetimes, and it's all going to be better. It's all bullshit. And in Islam, the so-called religion of peace, unfortunately, you have a very serious segment of that population that wants jihad against others who don't follow the same precepts. But what's weird is we all worship the same Abrahamic God, Jehovah, Yahweh. That's the same God worshipped in Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And this being and its behaviors and its genocidal, maniac, psychopathic actions, as outlined in all the holy books, acts just like Marduk and the Sumerian gods of the Sumerian legends. So we're dealing with interdimensional beings that have manipulated us spiritually and psychically for tens of thousands of years. And from time to time, humanity seems to go through a golden era where we're shaking some of this stuff off, and normal, sane, loving, empathetic people are attempting to go about their lives in a productive and responsible way and to create a good world and repair the damage that's been done here over many, many centuries. But then you have these manipulated events that are designed to make everybody afraid, make everybody hate each other, make everybody fall into horrible conclusions about each other. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the conspiracy theory or metaphysical alternative spirituality niche or movement this past week have been behaving like absolute shits. And I no longer feel even remotely connected to them. I have done a huge amount of remote viewing this past week to see what was really going on with the bombings. And I've done some very, very powerful shamanic work to attempt to correct some of the damage that was done to the psyche of millions of people on this planet, and to work on behalf of the souls of the people who died, and to understand better how we've been manipulated in our responses to this event. But I don't even really want to talk about it because that's drawing attention to me, and it just seems really tone deaf at a time of suffering when so many people are in a lot of pain right now. And they've been manipulated to feel that way. And I really, really hate the irresponsibility of all those supposed conspiracy researchers out there posting absolute crap. So, I'm sorry this is not a happier broadcast tonight, but I'm also a creature of truth, and I have a lot more to teach on these subjects. Quite often, I struggle with how much to share with people, because even though I've put myself way out there on a limb this past year with my publications and my free writings and my articles and my book. Yes, and you have to pay money for my book. Sorry, it actually costs money. And I've gotten a lot of kickback for that. I've also dealt with a huge amount of pushback for just this very little bit of work that I've done. And it includes the vulnerability of a couple family members, especially this past week. And I'm not entirely sure that I will continue publishing based on the hits that have happened. So I just want to get this audio out there, connect with people, tell you to question all the bullshit that's being promoted in the conspiracy circles, because there's a hysteria out there. I don't like the looks of it. It has nothing to do with what's really going on this planet. What's really going on is the same old shit. We're being manipulated to hate each other. We're being manipulated to point fingers at somebody else, whether it's our government, whether it's another country, whether it's poor disenfranchised white men who feel lonely and upset. It all comes down to, if we just gave a shit about each other and if we loved, none of this shit would happen. But there's an awful lot of noise out there right now about why we need to be upset, be afraid. Again, in my book, which is about time travel, and maybe that sounds too abstract, time is probability. They're the same thing. When you let people manipulate you into really horrible emotions and hating other people and hating yourself and hating life on this planet, you go down a very negative timeline or a very negative probability, and you'll start attracting worse and worse situations. And whenever one of these manipulated events is going on that trickles down to affect the earth on a lot of levels, know that there are various entities that want to herd you down a path of fear, a path of hatred, a path of dismay and demoralization. And it's being purposefully done. And if you're an empath like I am, you feel it. You know, these are seismic shocks that go around the world. But other countries and other groups of people often experience things their own way. And so these seismic events are really calculated to help large groups of people get very upset and very alienated and in a space of fear and hatred and powerlessness. I talk in my book about some very concrete things you can do to heal yourself of damage to your time body, which is one of the energy bodies that surrounds your physical body, so that you don't tend to attract these chaotic experiences and you can start moving away from those situations. But even as we go back to the macrocosm and the microcosm being related, as much as you want to pilot yourself onto a better probability, you are part of a world of 7 billion human souls and many billion more animal, plant, and mineral souls. We are part of a shared spiritual ecosystem. And when there is a really bad hit like this from a manipulative, dark group of entities that just want to enslave people and make us more hateful towards one another, try to find the man behind the curtain. And the man behind the curtain might be 2 kids who made some bad choices in Boston. It may be the Islamic fundamentalist people who funded them or gave them guns. It might also at the same time be certain government or black ops factions that are trying to create these manipulated false flag events. But on top of that, if you go up the hierarchy to the man behind the curtain, there's always negative entities in the lower astral planes that are trying to stir up trouble. And they're predictable. They've been with us for tens of thousands of years, folks. We got to stop giving them energy. We got to stop giving them power. And the minute we turn towards each other in hatred and in fear and in anger, and we objectify each other, we're moving down that path of the negative probability. And each individual who does that pulls others down with them. And my work is all about saying you have other options, and I'm giving you tools so that you don't have to be a part of that. But I can't honestly say today, April 24th, 2013, that I feel that there's anybody out there on the same path. It's been pretty lonely. I just see my contemporaries falling into madness. I hope and I hold the vision of something far greater for you, because you can do it. Don't let these characters out there poison you. You're an incredibly spiritually sovereign being. There are many solutions if you keep your heart open and you keep stepping into your power as a creator being, as a sovereign spiritual being, and as a being of integrity, honesty, and clarity. Thanks for letting me ramble at you tonight. It's been Jennifer Shepard, again, the Lipstick Mystic. Thanks very much.